Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad to find you settled in this quiet hour. Tell me, is there paper near you tonight? Perhaps a book left open, a pen resting where you last set it down. These are the small signs Watson noticed. The ink still wet, the candle burned low, the document that concealed its secret in plain sight. Tonight's story turns on precisely such a detail. A single, misdated line, and a conscience that could not hold its silence. Yes, do subscribe to Watson's Margins so no chapter reaches you late. The link to our Spotify channel rests in the description below. Now, draw the lamp a little closer, for as Holmes observed, it is a capital mistake to overlook what is quietly, patiently asking to be seen. Chapter 1. The Respectable Client. It is a singular quality of autumnal mornings in London that they seem designed expressly for the cultivation of unease. The light arrives thin and apologetic. The air carries the first intimations of approaching cold, and even the most cheerful of dispositions finds itself inclined toward a certain reflective gravity. It was upon such a morning, in the latter days of October, in the year 1895, that I found myself once more installed in the familiar sitting room at 221B Baker Street, renewing one of those companionable silences which, with Sherlock Holmes, were never truly silent at all. Holmes sat in his customary chair by the window, a long-stemmed pipe angled between his thin fingers, his grey eyes fixed upon the street below with that particular species of abstraction which I had learned to distinguish from genuine idleness. He was not idle. He was never idle, though he could simulate the condition with remarkable fidelity when it suited him. That morning, however, something in the set of his jaw and the faint elevation of his brows told me that his attention had been arrested by some object or event below, and that the languid pose was merely the stillness of a hunter who has sighted his quarry. I was engaged with the morning papers, and had not yet troubled him with conversation, a forbearance he invariably appreciated. Mrs. Hudson had brought up our breakfast at the usual hour, and the remains of it lay upon the table between us, companionable and unhurried. Outside, a hansom rattled over the cobblestones with periodic insistence. The coal fire snapped quietly. It was, in short, a morning of such unremarkable domesticity that what followed seemed all the more arresting by contrast. "There is a man below," said Holmes presently, without turning from the window, "who has been standing at the corner of the street for the past 4 minutes, consulting his watch with increasing frequency. He's of middle age, well dressed in the provincial fashion, carries a leather briefcase of considerable age but excellent preservation, and is at war with himself on some point of professional scruple. He will be at our door within 3 minutes, Watson. I should be obliged if you would refrain from offering him brandy unless he appears genuinely distressed. He is a solicitor, and solicitors, in my experience, perform better without stimulation." I set down my newspaper and regarded my companion with that mixture of admiration and mild exasperation which his pronouncement so habitually provoked. "How can you possibly determine that he is a solicitor?" Holmes turned from the window with a faint smile. "The briefcase, as I said, is old but immaculately maintained, which speaks to institutional pride rather than personal vanity. His hat is of better quality than his coat, suggesting that appearances are observed selectively, as is common among men who meet clients in formal settings, but spend their working hours among papers rather than persons. He has checked his watch 6 times in 4 minutes, not with the anxiety of a man who fears to be late, but with the deliberateness of one who is ensuring that he arrives at precisely the agreed hour. The legal profession sets great store by punctuality, Watson. It is, I sometimes think, their only unambiguous virtue." I was spared the necessity of a reply by the sound of the doorbell below, followed shortly by Mrs. Hudson's measured tread upon the stair. She appeared in the doorway with an expression of careful neutrality, the expression she invariably wore when admitting a visitor she had not yet classified. "A Mr. Alistair Pembroke to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says he has no appointment, but that the matter is of some urgency." "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson," said Holmes, settling back into his chair with an air of studied carelessness that I recognised as his preferred posture for receiving clients. It suggested ease without inviting familiarity. Mr. Alistair Pembroke proved to be very nearly as Holmes had described him, which was to say that he was a man of perhaps 55, erect in bearing, with silver-streaked hair brushed back from a broad, intelligent forehead, and the kind of measured, deliberate gaze that comes from long years of reading documents closely and human beings with even greater care. His coat was serviceable rather than elegant, but his linen was immaculate. He carried the briefcase Holmes had noted. Dark brown leather polished to a discreet lustre. He entered the room with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being received, though I observed a certain tension about the mouth and the careful manner in which he set the briefcase upon his knee when Holmes gestured him toward the visitor's chair, as though the contents demanded particular solicitude. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I am grateful that you will see me without prior arrangement. I am Alistair Pembroke, solicitor, of the firm Pembroke and Cartwright, with offices in Dorchester. I act for the Trevelyan family of Dorsetshire, and I find myself in the possession of a problem which, I confess, lies somewhat beyond the ordinary resources of my profession." "Pray proceed," said Holmes, his fingers pressed together at the tips in that familiar attitude of concentration which to the uninitiated might have suggested boredom. Pembroke drew a slow breath, as though gathering the threads of a prepared account. "My client is the Trevelyan estate, and more particularly the interests of Miss Eleanor Trevelyan, widowed sister of the late Sir Matthew Trevelyan, who died in state in the general sense some 8 months ago. Sir Matthew was a landowner of considerable consequence, a man of regular habits, and I should say, of rather rigid principles. His estate at Trevelyan Court encompasses some 400 acres of good Dorsetshire farmland, and is of no inconsiderable value." "Sir Matthew's will," Holmes interjected quietly, "disposed of the estate in what manner?" Pembroke glanced at him with a flash of professional approval. "In favour of his sister, Miss Eleanor, with provision for several servants of long standing. The will was properly drawn, properly witnessed, and entirely unambiguous. Miss Eleanor has resided at the court since Sir Matthew's death, and expected, as did we all, to continue to do so. There was no impediment and no contention, until, that is, 3 weeks ago." He opened the briefcase with the deliberate care of a man unpacking something fragile, and withdrew a folder of documents, from which he extracted a single sheet of papers enclosed in a transparent covering. Even from where I sat, I could see that the documents were of considerable antiquity, written upon vellum of a yellowish cast in an antique hand. "This," said Pembroke, "is a copy. The original is secured in my office in Dorchester. What you see is a medieval charter, apparently dated to the 14th year of Edward IV's reign, purporting to record the transfer of certain lands within the Trevelyan estate to an ancestor of one Mr. Edward Harbury, a distant cousin of Sir Matthew's. If genuine, this charter predates and supersedes all subsequent arrangements concerning that portion of the land, and would, under a most particular and technical application of property law, transfer a significant part of the estate away from Miss Eleanor and into the hands of Mr. Harbury." I watched Holmes as Pembroke spoke. His eyes had sharpened perceptibly, that grey gaze becoming almost luminescent in its concentration. He reached across without ceremony and took the document from Pembroke's hands, holding it at arm's length and examining it with the unhurried thoroughness of a connoisseur. "Where was this discovered?" he asked, still studying the document. "By Mr. Jasper Linton, Sir Matthew's former private secretary. He was engaged in cataloguing the late baronet's papers, and came upon it among a collection of older family documents stored in a cabinet in the study. He brought it to my attention immediately. I will say that for him, and I have consulted 2 specialists in medieval property law, both of whom declined to give a definitive opinion without further examination. And Mr. Harbury himself, how does he receive this development?" Pembroke paused, and I thought I detected in his hesitation something that went beyond mere professional caution. with what I can only describe as great reluctance, Mr. Holmes. He is not a wealthy man, but he has expressed himself as deeply uncomfortable with the situation and has urged me to resolve it as swiftly as possible. He says, and I believe him sincerely, that he has no wish to profit from what may be a clerical error or worse. Holmes set the document upon the table and regarded Pembroke with an expression of quiet alertness. You said or worse, Mr. Pembroke. You are, therefore, entertaining the possibility of deliberate fraud. The solicitor met his gaze steadily. I am a man of law, Mr. Holmes. I entertain possibilities until they are excluded by evidence. I have not accused anyone. I do not suspect anyone in particular, but I should be failing in my duty to my client if I did not pursue every avenue with rigour. He paused again, then added with quiet emphasis, Documents, Mr. Holmes, do not misstate themselves. There was a brief silence, in which Holmes remained entirely still, his eyes upon some middle distance beyond the solicitor's head. Then the faintest of smiles crossed his austere features. No, he said softly, they do not. They require assistance. He turned to me with a decisive air. What do you say, Watson? Dorsetshire at this season has its consolations. I confess I find medieval land law considerably less tedious than its reputation suggests. I confess that I required very little persuasion. There was something in the quality of Pembroke's account, and still more in the careful gravity with which Holmes had received it, that told me plainly we were in the presence of something more than a legal curiosity. I said as much to Holmes later that evening, as we sat together over the last of the fire. He nodded slowly, filling his pipe with deliberate attention. Documents seldom err, Watson, he said at last, and when they appear to do so, it is invariably because some human hand has assisted the error along. The question is not whether this charter has been tampered with. I am already fairly certain that it has. The question is who did so, and why they chose a method subtle enough to deceive two legal specialists. He drew upon the pipe and exhaled a long, thoughtful column of smoke. That, my dear fellow, is what makes the business interesting. We departed for Dorsetshire the following morning on the 9:15 from Waterloo, and I remember thinking, as the grey sprawl of London gave way to the cleaner lines of the autumn countryside, that Holmes was in unusually good spirits for a man embarked upon a case involving forgery and property law. It was only later, much later, that I came to understand why. Chapter 2. Trevelyan Court. The train carried us southwest through a landscape that grew progressively more ancient and self-possessed as London receded, as though the land itself were shedding the nervous energy of the city and settling back into something older and less easily hurried. The chalk downs gave way to heavier country, all dark hedgerows and wide meadows under a sky the colour of pewter, and by the time we drew into Dorchester I had the impression that we had travelled not merely 100 miles but a considerable distance backward in time. Pembroke had arranged a conveyance from the station, a solid, unhurried trap drawn by a cob of similar temperament, and we were met at the platform by the solicitor himself, who had travelled down the previous day to prepare the household for our arrival. He greeted us with the subdued efficiency of a man who had been managing other people's difficulties for 30 years and had long since ceased to be surprised by the forms they took. The drive to Trevelyan Court occupied the better part of an hour. Holmes spent most of it in silence, and watching the country with an attention that I recognised as purposeful rather than appreciative. He noted, I observed, the condition of the field walls, the arrangement of the tenant cottages we passed, and the state of the approach lane, which was well maintained though not recently so. Once he remarked upon a stretch of fencing that had been repaired with materials conspicuously newer than those surrounding it, and once he asked Pembroke, without apparent relevance, whether the estate managed its own farms or leased to tenants. Pembroke replied that the Trevelyan lands had been almost entirely tenanted for 2 generations, and Holmes nodded as though this confirmed something he had already suspected, and said nothing further. Trevelyan Court itself emerged from a stand of copper beeches as we rounded the last bend of the lane, and it was, I thought, a house that suited its landscape rather too exactly for comfort. It was a late Georgian building of grey stone, square and unadorned, with tall windows that caught the flat afternoon light and returned it without warmth. The gardens before it were tidy but austere, the borders cut back severely for the season, and the overall impression was of a place maintained with the rigorous conscientiousness of duty rather than the easier hand of affection. It was, in short, a house that told you something about its late owner before you had crossed the threshold. We were received by Mrs. Briggs, the housekeeper, a stout, composed woman of perhaps 60, with iron grey hair drawn back under a cap and the quality of stillness that belongs to those long accustomed to managing large households without raising their voices. She welcomed us with precise formality, showed us to our rooms on the upper floor, and informed us that Miss Trevelyan would receive us in the drawing-room at 4 o'clock, if that was convenient. The word convenient in her delivery indicated plainly that it was not a question. Holmes glanced about the entrance hall as we passed through it with that swift, comprehensive survey which I had witnessed so many times, and which never failed to disconcert those unfamiliar with its thoroughness. He paused for a fraction of a second before a set of portraits ranged along the inner wall, long enough, I knew, to have registered and filed their every detail, then followed Mrs. Briggs upstairs without remark. At 4 o'clock precisely we descended to the drawing-room, and I found myself in the presence of Miss Eleanor Trevelyan. She was a woman of perhaps 50, rather younger than I had for some reason anticipated, with a composed, fine-featured face from which the colour had been withdrawn by recent strain without diminishing its fundamental strength. She wore black still, the mourning not yet laid aside, and she received us standing, which I took for a mark of dignity rather than formality. Her eyes were dark and steadily attentive, and when she offered her hand there was nothing of the supplicant about her, nothing of the besieged property-holder clutching at a champion. She was simply a composed, intelligent woman, in the midst of a difficulty she intended to meet on her own terms. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I am grateful that you have come. Though I confess I am uncertain what conclusions can be reached that my solicitor's specialists have been unable to reach before you." "Very possibly the same conclusions," said Holmes pleasantly, accepting the chair she indicated, "reached by a somewhat different path. You must forgive a professional habit of preferring first-hand observation to second-hand report." She received this without displeasure, and we sat down together, Pembroke taking a chair near the window and removing a small notebook from his breast pocket, with the resigned air of a man who knows he's about to be peripheral to events. I shall compress somewhat the substance of what passed in that first interview, recording only what bore upon the case. Miss Eleanor spoke of her brother with a care that suggested she was choosing her words not to conceal anything but to be precise. Sir Matthew, she said, had been a man of strong convictions and stronger habits, just and rigorous in all formal respects, but not, she acknowledged quietly, a man whose justice had been tempered by any great measure of imagination. He had managed the estate according to principles inherited from his father and saw no reason to revise them. The tenants had been treated as the terms of their leases required and not otherwise. It was Holmes's question about the tenants that produced the only visible alteration in her composure. It was subtle, no more than a fractional stiffening of the hands in her lap, and I noted it only because I had been watching for precisely such small departures from her general steadiness. "The tenants," she said, after a brief pause, "were a matter on which my brother and I did not always concur. Holmes did not pursue it. He had the gift, rarer than it is commonly supposed, of knowing which threads to leave untugged at the first interview. Mr. Edward Harbury came in shortly before 5, having ridden over from the inn at the village where he had been lodging since Pembroke had summoned him to account for the charter's implications. He was a man of 35 or thereabouts, lean and weather-browned, with an open, unsophisticated face that wore its current discomfort without any effort at concealment. He shook hands with the directness of a man unused to drawing rooms and apologised for his riding clothes with a self-possession that rather endeared him to me. "I want you to know," he said to Holmes, almost before the introductions were complete, "that I have no desire whatever to press this claim. The whole business has been a most infernal embarrassment, and if the document proves to be what I half suspect it is, I shall be more relieved than anyone in this room. "And what do you half suspect it is?" Holmes asked. Harbury met his gaze squarely. "I suspect somebody has gone to a great deal of trouble on my behalf without my knowledge or consent. I cannot conceive who or why, but that is my honest impression." Holmes studied him for a moment with an expression I could not quite read, then said, "Thank you, Mr. Harbury. That is a more useful statement than you may realise." We met Mr. Jasper Linton last of all in the study where the disputed cabinet stood. He came to us rather than being brought, appearing in the doorway with a diffidence that was almost physical, a slight man of 40 with a scholar's stoop and fingers ink-stained at the tips. He had been Sir Matthew's secretary for 11 years, he told us, and had undertaken the cataloguing of the papers at Miss Eleanor's request, as a final service to the household before seeking new employment. He answered Holmes's questions about the discovery of the charter with careful accuracy, indicating the precise cabinet, the precise folder, the precise sequence of events. He was thorough and composed, and yet as we prepared to leave the study, Holmes paused and asked, apparently as an afterthought, whether Linton had handled the document before placing it in its covering. Linton said that he had, briefly. Holmes thanked him and said nothing more until we were outside in the corridor, where he murmured to me in a voice below the threshold of any passing ear, "He is frightened, Watson, not of us, of something already in motion." I asked him what he meant, but he only shook his head and glanced back at the study door with an expression of quiet attention that I knew better than to interrupt with further questions. The house had begun to speak to him in its own language, and he was listening. Chapter 3. The Sudden Death. There is a particular quality of silence that precedes bad news in a country house. It is not the silence of peace or of early morning, but something thicker and more purposeful, as though the walls themselves have absorbed a shock and are holding it in abeyance until the household is ready to receive it. I woke on the second morning of our stay at Trevelyan Court to exactly that quality of stillness, and lay for a moment attending to it before the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor resolved my unease into something more specific and more urgent. Holmes was already dressed when I knocked at the adjoining door, which told me that he had either not slept at all or had heard what I had not. He was standing at his window, coat on, surveying the gravel drive below with the focused attention of a man who has received a preliminary report and is awaiting confirmation. "Linton," he said, without turning. It was not a question. Mrs. Briggs found him at 7:30, when his breakfast tray went unanswered. His door was locked from within, the key still in the lock, and when the under-footman was sent for the spare, they found Jasper Linton lying on his bed in his day clothes, composed as a man who had chosen to rest for a moment and had simply not resumed. The local physician, a Dr. Alderton from the village of Wyndham Tracy, 2 miles distant, was summoned and arrived within the half-hour. His preliminary examination was unhurried, and his conclusion, delivered to the assembled household in the entrance hall, carried the measured authority of a man announcing what he had largely expected. "Heart failure," he said. "Mr. Linton was known to me. He had a nervous constitution and a cardiac condition of some standing. There is nothing, on present examination, to suggest any cause other than natural failure brought on by the accumulated strain of recent weeks." He paused and added, as though anticipating objection, "The locked door and the undisturbed state of the room are entirely consistent with this conclusion." Holmes listened to this pronouncement with his arms folded and his gaze directed at some point approximately 18 inches above Dr. Alderton's head. He asked 3 questions: whether Linton had appeared unwell the previous evening, to which Alderton said he could not speak, not having seen him; whether the cardiac condition had previously produced episodes of acute distress, to which the answer was yes, twice in the preceding year; and whether a post-mortem examination was to be conducted. Alderton looked faintly surprised. "In a case of this nature, with a known condition and no signs of disturbance, I should not ordinarily recommend one." "No," said Holmes pleasantly. "I suppose you should not." He said nothing further in the hall, and I followed him upstairs to Linton's room, where the body had not yet been removed, and the local constable, a young man named Rees, who had the conscientious air of someone performing his first significant duty stood to one side of the door with his notebook. Holmes nodded to him, introduced us briefly, and entered the room with that particular quality of forward stillness that I can only describe as purposeful quiet. The room was that of a careful, methodical man. The bookshelves were orderly, the papers on the desk arranged in neat stacks, the travelling case in the corner strapped shut and labelled. Linton lay on the counterpane as Dr. Alderton had described, his jacket still on, his shoes still laced, his hands at his sides with a peculiar composure that struck me as a physician as slightly inconsistent with the disordered physical distress that cardiac failure generally produced. Yet I did not say so immediately, as Holmes had not yet spoken, and I had learned not to offer observations before he had completed his own. He moved through the room in his customary manner, neither hurrying nor lingering, his attention passing over each surface with equal dispassion. He examined the writing desk without touching it, bending low to view the objects upon it from an oblique angle. He spent some moments at the small cast-iron grate set into the far wall, I crouching before it and removing from his pocket the small lens he habitually carried. He examined the mantelpiece, the window-sill, the bedside table, and the inside of the wardrobe door. Then he straightened, clasped his hands behind his back, and stood for a long moment in the centre of the room looking at nothing in particular, which meant he was looking at everything simultaneously. "The fire," I said at last, for I had noticed it and could not forbear mentioning it. "It was lit last night, though the weather hardly demanded it." Holmes glanced at the grate with what might have been approval, though with Holmes the distinction between approval and coincidental attention was not always easy to establish. "Just so. And observe the grate itself, Watson. The ash is considerable, rather more than a single evening's fire for warmth would produce. Something beyond coal was burned. Paper, at a guess, and a quantity of it, though not all of it committed to the flames in time." He produced with a care that bespoke its importance a fragment of burned paper from the grate. It was no larger than a visiting card and bore upon its unburned edge perhaps a dozen words in a small, precise hand. I leaned over his shoulder and read what remained. The fragmentary phrase "consult" before any further, and then a trailing scorch that consumed whatever followed. Linton intended to travel to London, Holmes said, more half to himself. Pembroke mentioned it yesterday evening, you will recall. He had written to a specialist in medieval documents requesting an appointment. He set the fragment down upon the mantelpiece and turned to the desk. The letter requesting that appointment is no longer among his papers. The desk drawer, you will note, has been replaced in its runners at a slightly incorrect angle. It was searched, and searched by someone who is thorough but not quite familiar with the precise way in which Linton habitually arranged it. He showed me the drawer, and I saw what he meant. The papers inside were orderly, but orderly in the manner of papers that have been replaced after examination rather than the organic order of a man's own habitual use. There is a difference, subtle but real, and Holmes had seen it where I might not have done. Constable Rees, who had been listening from the doorway with growing discomfort, cleared his throat. "Mr. Holmes, sir, Dr. Alderton is quite satisfied as to the cause of death. The door was locked, as you know, from the inside. The window was latched. I have examined both." "I do not dispute Dr. Alderton's findings as to the immediate cause," said Holmes, turning to him with a courtesy that was entirely genuine. "Heart failure is a perfectly adequate explanation for what killed Mr. Linton. The question that interests me is what brought him to the condition in which his heart failed." He paused, and then added more quietly, "They are not the same question, Constable, and it would be a great convenience to someone if they continued to be treated as though they were." We found one further thing before we left the room. Holmes had gone down on one knee beside the bedside table, and was examining the small tray upon which Linton's nightly preparations had been arranged. A glass, a carafe of water, and a small brown bottle of the kind dispensed by country pharmacists for the relief of nervous ailments. Holmes uncorked it, passed it briefly beneath his nose, and recorked it with the careful deliberation of a man who has found precisely what he expected to find and is not yet prepared to say so. He straightened, pocketed his lens, and looked at me with an expression that I had encountered before and that never failed to produce in me a sensation compounded equally of intellectual excitement and something approaching dread. A man with a known heart condition, he said, under considerable strain, who intended to travel to London to consult an expert, whose papers have been searched, whose correspondence has been partially burned, and whose nightly medicine requires, I think, rather closer attention than doctor. Alderton has seen fit to give it. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand upon the frame. This is not a death that crept up upon Jasper Linton unannounced, Watson. It was, I am fairly certain, assisted to its conclusion. I looked once more at the composed still figure on the bed, and at the cold grate, and at the desk drawer that did not quite sit true in its runners, and found that I had very little to say in contradiction. Chapter 4. Signs of Design. Holmes said very little for the remainder of that morning. This was not unusual in itself, for there were phases of an investigation during which speech was, for him, a positive impediment to thought, and he guarded those phases with a resolute silence that even I, after long familiarity, did not presume to breach without cause. What was less usual was the character of his inactivity. He did not pace, did not reach for his pipe, did not fill the sitting room assigned to us with the dense blue atmosphere that invariably signalled sustained cerebration. He simply sat, very still, in the chair nearest the window, with his long fingers resting open upon his knees, and his gaze directed at the middle distance beyond the glass, and I had the impression of a man engaged not in solving a problem, but in determining its precise dimensions, before committing himself to any particular method of attack. I occupied myself with my own reflections, which were, I confess, less ordered than I should have liked. I had examined Linton's body with the eye of a medical man, while Holmes had examined the room with the eye of whatever Holmes was, and my findings, though I had not yet voiced them fully, were not comfortable ones. The composure of the body had troubled me from the first. Cardiac failure induced by acute stress produces in its final moments a physical agitation that leaves its traces. Linton's attitude had been too settled, too arranged, and while I was prepared to allow that I might be reading too much into a single impression, the medicine bottle in Holmes's pocket was a consideration of a different order entirely. Just before noon, Holmes rose abruptly from his chair, as though a decision had been arrived at by some internal mechanism that operated quite independently of visible deliberation, and suggested that we pay a visit to the village of Wyndham Tracy. He did not explain why, and I did not ask, having long since learned that his explanations arrived at the moment of his choosing and not before. The day was sharp and clear, the autumn light lending the country lane a pale, scoured beauty that might at another time have prompted me to remark upon it. Holmes walked beside me in silence for the first quarter mile, then said, without preliminary, "Linton wrote 2 letters on the day before his death. We have established that one was to the document specialist in London, and that this letter was subsequently removed from his desk. I want to know what became of the second." I asked how he could be certain there was a second letter. "The sealing wax upon his desk," Holmes replied. "There were 2 distinct poolings of it on the leather surface, which indicates 2 separate acts of sealing. One pool was adjacent to a small smear of candle tallow consistent with a man leaning forward over a flame to melt the wax. The second was nearer the desk's edge, at the angle at which a left-handed man would most naturally work." He paused. "Linton was right-handed, Watson. He reached the second letter across his body. It was addressed to someone on his left, which is to say someone physically present in the room when he sealed it, to whom he may have passed it directly rather than committing it to the post. I turned this over. You think the second letter was delivered by hand to someone in the house, or to someone who visited the house that afternoon? Mrs. Briggs will know who called, if anyone did. She's not a woman who misses arrivals." We were bound for Wyndham Tracy, it emerged, yet on a double errand. Holmes wished to examine the village's postal records for any letter dispatched by Linton in the preceding weeks, and he wished also to call upon Dr. Alderton, in whose surgery the medicine bottle was now lodged, along with Holmes's courteous but unambiguous request that its contents be preserved pending further inquiry. Alderton received us in his consulting room with the cautious civility of a professional man who suspects he may have underestimated something, but is not yet willing to concede as much. He was a compact, sandy-haired man of 50, with the bronzed hands of a country doctor, and a directness of manner that I found on the whole admirable, even in its present defensiveness. "I have not altered my opinion," he said, settling behind his desk and folding those hands upon it. "Mr. Linton died of cardiac failure. I have attended him for 2 years, and I was familiar with his condition." "And the contents of the bottle?" Holmes asked. Alderton hesitated by no more than a fraction of a second. "A preparation of valerian and bromide dispensed by myself some 6 weeks ago for the relief of his nervous symptoms. A standard preparation, entirely appropriate to his case. Might I ask the precise dosage?" 20 drops in water, to be taken on retiring." He met Holmes's gaze. "The bottle was approximately 2/3 consumed, consistent with 6 weeks of use at that rate." Holmes nodded and said nothing further on the matter, to my considerable surprise. On the pavement outside, however, he said quietly, "The bottle was 3/4 consumed when I examined it this morning, Watson. Either Alderton is misremembering, or the last dose administered to Linton was somewhat in excess of 20 drops. He walked on a few paces. "A large dose of bromide in a man with a compromised heart, combined with the natural anxiety of his situation, would not be difficult to arrange, and would produce, in an elderly country physician expecting natural causes, precisely the presentation we have witnessed. At the village post office, a small establishment presided over by a Mrs. Tremlett of impressive recall, Holmes made his inquiries with the mild, raw, unhurried charm he employed when he wished to put a witness entirely at their ease. Mrs. Tremlett confirmed, with the satisfaction of a woman whose observations are rarely solicited and invariably precise, that Mr. Linton had posted a single letter in the past fortnight, some 9 days previously. It had been directed, she said, to an address in London. She had noticed the recipient's name because it was an unusual one, a Dr. Francis Carew of Bloomsbury. Holmes thanked her warmly, and we turned back toward the court. "Francis Carew," I said. "Is he known to you?" "He is known to anyone who reads the Transactions of the Paleographical Society," said Holmes. "He is perhaps the foremost living authority on medieval English manuscript hands. Linton did not write to him the day before his death, Watson. He wrote to him 9 days ago. The letter we found evidence of at the desk, the one subsequently removed, was a second communication, likely a follow-up, likely more urgent in its tone." "Which means Linton's concerns about the charter were not sudden," I said slowly. "He had been troubled by it for the better part of a fortnight, and had said nothing to Pembroke or to anyone in the house." Holmes paused at the gate of the court and looked up at its grey, regular facade with an expression of absorbed attention, as though the building itself were a document he was in the process of reading. Consider the implication. A man who has discovered something disturbing about a document he himself unearthed, who consults an outside expert privately rather than raising the matter with his employer or her solicitor, who is sufficiently unsettled to write a second time, and who, on the day he apparently resolves to travel to London in person, is found dead. I said what we were both thinking. He knew the charter was not genuine. "More than that," Holmes said, pushing open the gate. "I believe Linton knew precisely how it had been altered, and by whom, and I believe that knowledge, and his intention to act upon it, was the thing that killed him." He stopped at the front step and turned to me with an expression of great seriousness. "We are not, Watson, in the presence of a passionate crime. Passion is careless, and there is nothing careless about any of this. What we have here is the considered action of an intelligent mind that perceived a threat and addressed it with the minimum necessary force." He reached for the bell pull. "That is a considerably more dangerous thing than passion, and it requires considerably more care on our part." The door opened before he could ring, and Mrs. Briggs stood in the frame. her composure as absolute as ever, her eyes moving between us with an attention that was, now that I looked for it, rather more acute than mere professional alertness. Holmes regarded her for a moment with a pleasant, unrevealing expression. "Mrs. Briggs," he said, "I wonder if you might tell me who called upon Mr. Linton yesterday afternoon?" Something shifted, briefly and almost invisibly, in the geography of her face. "No one called upon Mr. Linton, Mr. Holmes," she said. Holmes smiled at her with great cordiality. "How very interesting," he said, and stepped inside. Chapter 5. The Weight of Conscience. Holmes requested his private interview with Miss Eleanor Trevelyan that same afternoon, and she granted it without demur, though with a quietness that suggested she had been expecting it. I was not invited to remain, which was unusual enough to be deliberate, and I understood from it that Holmes wished the interview unmediated by even so familiar a presence as my own. I occupied myself instead with a closer examination of the grounds. Walking the kitchen garden and the stable yard and the broad southern lawn, with the purposeful aimlessness of a man who is thinking rather than looking, and who finds movement useful to the process, the afternoon had turned colder, a thin wind moving across the open meadows and pressing against the hedgerows with a sound like distant water. The estate, viewed from the south lawn, presented its best and most composed face, the grey stone of the house sitting solidly against a sky of darkening pewter, the bare-limbed beeches along the eastern boundary standing with the patient dignity of things that have outlasted several of the ambitions laid at their roots. It was a landscape of considerable beauty, and it spoke in the particular register of beauty that is inseparable from the sense of things enduring. I found myself thinking of the tenant cottages we had passed on the lane from Dorchester, their walls sound, their windows intact, but their gardens showing the particular neglect of people who have learned not to invest too deeply in what they do not own. Holmes emerged from the house at 5:15, descending the front steps with his coat collar turned up against the wind and his expression in that settled inward state which followed upon interviews of significance. He fell into step beside me without preamble, and we walked the length of the south lawn in silence before he spoke. "She is a woman," he said at last, "of considerable inner resource. She has been carrying something for a long time, Watson, and she carries it the way such people carry things, not lightly, but with such practised steadiness that the weight has become indistinguishable from her general bearing." He paused. "She did not confide in me, but she confirmed several things she had no intention of confirming." I asked which things. That her relationship with her brother in his final years was one of formal cordiality concealing profound disagreement. That the matter of the tenants was not, as she suggested yesterday, a minor point of domestic difference, but a sustained and serious dispute of several years' standing. And that she was not, as she would have me believe, entirely surprised by the discovery of the charter. He glanced at me sidelong. "She showed no surprise, Watson. When I raised the subject obliquely, yes, she exhibited strain and care, and a very precise attention to the manner of her answers, but not surprise. Surprise is a reflexive thing. It cannot be manufactured on demand by even the most composed of intelligences, and she did not produce it." "You think she knew of the charter before Linton brought it to Pembroke?" "I think it is possible she knew of it considerably before Linton brought it to anyone." He stopped walking and looked out across the meadow with a slight narrowing of the eyes as though the landscape afforded some useful perspective. "But I am not yet in a position to say what she knew and what she merely suspected. And in a matter of this kind, the distinction is not trivial." He did not speak again of the interview until after dinner, when we had retreated to our sitting-room and Holmes had at last permitted himself the pipe he had been forgoing, with the quiet, deliberate self-denial he occasionally practised when he wished to keep his perceptions unclouded. I was writing up my notes in the small diary I kept on active cases, and Holmes was at the writing desk with Sir Matthew's account books, yet 3 of which Pembroke had obtained access to earlier in the day, and which Holmes had carried to our room under his arm with the absorption of a man who has been given exactly the text he wished to study. He read in silence for the better part of an hour. I had long since set down my pen and was staring at the fire when he spoke. "Come and look at this, Watson." The ledgers were old, their entries rendered in a formal copperplate that was Sir Matthew's own hand, meticulous and unvarying across a span of 12 years. Holmes indicated a series of entries from the spring of 4 years previously. Rental arrears recorded against 6 tenant names, and against each name, at a subsequent date, a single notation in red ink. The notation, rendered in abbreviated form, read simply, "Sequence and a date." "Sequestration," I said. "The legal seizure of assets against unpaid debt," Holmes confirmed. 6 families in the spring of that year, and a further 4 the following autumn. He turned the page and indicated a different column, one headed Miscellaneous Receipts, in which appeared, in the months following each sequestration, sums that were not negligible. The seized goods were sold. The proceeds entered here. The tenants in question, I would venture, did not remain tenants for long thereafter. He leaned back from the desk and regarded the ledger with an expression that combined professional satisfaction with something rather cooler. The expression I had noticed over the years that crossed his features when an investigation revealed not merely crime, but the older, quieter damage that crime was sometimes constructed to address. Miss Eleanor told me during our interview that she had attempted to dissuade her brother from the sequestrations, that he had dismissed her arguments on the grounds that sentiment had no place in estate management. He picked up his pipe, looked at it, and set it down again. "She told me this unprompted, Watson, which is to say, she told me more than she intended. She was establishing for my benefit the moral geography of her position. She wanted me to understand that she had tried the legitimate course." "Before she tried the other one," I said. Holmes looked at me steadily. "Before someone tried the other one. Let us preserve the appropriate distinctions a little longer." But the careful formulation did not entirely disguise the direction of his thought, and we both knew it. He rose and moved to stand before the fireplace, and the quality of his stillness there was different from the abstracted quiet of the afternoon. It had resolution in it, the stillness of a man who has taken the measure of a problem and is now deciding upon the pace and manner of his approach. "There is one further thing," he said. "In the course of our walk about the grounds this afternoon, you will have passed the eastern kitchen garden." I said that I had. "There is a section of the far wall where the mortar between 2 courses of stone is noticeably fresher than that surrounding it, perhaps 18 inches in width, and recent. Within the past year, I should say." He glanced at me. "I should like to examine it more closely before the light goes entirely tomorrow morning. I have a feeling it may tell us something about the confidence with which certain arrangements were made." I asked what he expected to find. "Confirmation," he said simply, and moved toward the window to draw the curtain against the night. "Every plan of the kind I'm beginning to perceive requires at some point a place of safekeeping. Documents, Watson, particularly documents of disputed provenance, cannot simply be kept in a drawer. They require somewhere that their custodian considers secure." He pulled the curtain to and turned back to the room. "The mortar is new, but the workmanship is careful. It was done by someone who knew how to conceal the repair in plain sight, and who had sufficient control over the household to ensure that no one remarked upon it." He finally allowed himself the pipe then, settling into his chair with the first visible relaxation of the day, and the blue smoke rose in long, deliberate spirals toward the ceiling. I watched it, thinking of the composed, fine-featured woman who had sat across from him that afternoon and given nothing away that she had not calculated, and of the account books with their red ink notations and their entries of miscellaneous receipts, and of a section of kitchen garden wall whose fresh mortar shone, if one knew where to look, like a small involuntary confession. "Holmes," I said presently, "do you feel any sympathy for her?" He considered this with apparent seriousness. "I feel the respect that is owed to an intelligent and determined mind," he said at last. "Sympathy is your province, Watson. Mine is accuracy." He drew upon the pipe and exhaled slowly, "though I will confess that the two are not always as far apart as some people imagine." He said nothing further, and after a time I took myself to bed. leaving him to the fire and the ledgers and whatever else occupied the particular silence he maintained when a case had reached the point at which all the evidence was assembled, but not yet arranged into its final and irrefutable form. Chapter 6. Loyalty and Fear. Holmes was abroad before sunrise the following morning. I knew this because I heard the creak of the back staircase at a little before 6 o'clock, a sound quite distinct from the heavier tread of the household staff. And when I descended at 7:30, he was already at the breakfast table, his boots carrying a narrow band of fresh clay at the heel, consistent with the kitchen garden path, his expression that of a man who has confirmed what he expected to confirm, and is neither surprised nor entirely satisfied to have done so. He said nothing of the morning's excursion, responding to my inquiry with a slight elevation of the brows that meant the subject would keep, and applied himself to his breakfast with an appetite that told me, at least, that whatever he had found had not been discouraging. Mrs. Briggs presided over the breakfast arrangements with her customary silent efficiency, appearing and withdrawing with the measured invisibility of a woman who has spent 40 years perfecting the art of being present without intruding. Holmes watched her with a pleasantness so consistently maintained that it had itself become a form of scrutiny, and after the third such appearance and withdrawal he said, with the conversational ease of a man raising a matter of no particular consequence, that he would be grateful for a few minutes of her time when the morning's work permitted. She received this, as she received most things, without visible alteration, and said that she would be in the still room after 11 if Mr. Holmes wished to call upon her there. The still room was at the back of the house, a low-ceilinged and stone-flagged space that smelled of dried lavender and beeswax and the particular mineral coolness of old walls. Shelving along three sides bore the ordered evidence of decades of domestic industry, preserved fruits, bottled herbs, folded linens awaiting distribution. Mrs. Briggs stood at the central table when we entered, occupied with the labelling of several small jars, and she continued this occupation for a deliberate moment after our arrival, before setting down her pen and giving us her full attention. It was not rudeness. It was the assertion, quiet but unmistakable, of a woman on her own ground. Holmes took the chair she indicated, and I remained standing near the door, notebook open in the manner that I had found, over many years, tended to put witnesses at their ease by suggesting that their account was valued enough to be recorded. "You have been with the Trevelyan family for a long time, Mrs. Briggs," Holmes began. 37 years, she said. "I came to the house as a girl under Sir Matthew's father. I have known Miss Eleanor since she was 9 years old. Then you will understand that what I am about to ask you is not intended as any reflection upon your loyalty to this household, but as a necessary step in protecting it." He paused, and when she made no reply he continued in the same measured tone. "Mr. Linton had become anxious and secretive in the weeks before his death. You noticed this. I believe you told Pembroke as much. I noticed a change in him," she said carefully. "He was not himself. He spoke to you." It was not framed as a question, and she knew it. She was quiet for a moment, her hands resting upon the edge of the table in a stillness that was not composed so much as determined. "He said that he was troubled about something he had found among the papers," she said at last. "He did not tell me what, and he said he intended to set matters right." Her eyes moved to Holmes with a sharpness that she did not attempt to conceal. "How did you know that?" "Because it is the kind of thing a man in his position would say," Holmes replied simply. "A man who has discovered that he has been, whether knowingly or otherwise, made party to something he finds unconscionable. The precise phrase matters less than the sentiment behind it. He was preparing to act, and he wanted someone in the household to know that he had reached that resolution." Holmes leaned forward very slightly. "He trusted you, Mrs. Briggs. That is evident. The question I need you to answer is whether, in your desire to protect this household, you took any action that may have reached the ears of another person before Linton was able to carry out his intention." The silence that followed was the longest of the interview. Outside the still-room window a robin sang briefly and stopped, and somewhere in the house above us a door opened and closed. Mrs. Briggs looked at the jars on the table before her, and then at her own hands with an expression I could only describe as the outward appearance of a reckoning. "I told Miss Eleanor," she said, "that same evening. I thought she should know that Linton was in a state of mind that might cause difficulties. I thought I was acting in the household's interest." She stopped. The word interest sat in the air between us with a weight that had not been there a moment before. Holmes said gently, "Of course you did." She looked up at him then, and I saw in her face something that the composure of the preceding days had entirely obscured, a fatigue so deep and of such long standing that it had the quality of grief. "Is he truly gone?" she asked. "Linton? Was it natural?" "I am not yet in a position to say with certainty," Holmes said. It was true as far as it went, and he delivered it with a compassion that I found, in that moment, entirely characteristic of a side of his nature that he habitually kept from general view. "But I want you to consider very carefully whether there is anything else you observed in the days before his death that you have not yet mentioned. Anything at all, however small." She was quiet again for a long moment, and when she spoke it was with the care of a woman examining each word before committing it to the air. "The evening before he died," she said, "I noticed when I passed his door to extinguish the hall lamp that there was a light still under it, quite late, and I heard voices, no words, only the tone of them." She paused. It was not a friendly conversation. Holmes asked how late. "After 10:30. The house was otherwise settled." "Two voices?" "I believed so, but I cannot be certain." "The door is thick." Holmes thanked her and rose, and I moved to follow him when he stopped and turned back with the suddenness of a man who has nearly overlooked something. His gaze dropped to her apron, to a small, irregular discoloration along the lower edge of the pocket, dark against the white cotton, a burn mark, elongated and faint, of the kind left by a flying ember rather than a sustained flame. "Your apron," he said quietly. That mark is recent." She glanced down at it with the briefest of contractions about her eyes. "I was clearing a grate," she said, "the morning after Mr. Linton was found." "Which grate?" A pause of perhaps 2 seconds. "My own, in my sitting room." Holmes regarded her steadily for a moment, and then gave a small grave nod, as though accepting an answer he had anticipated, and found no reason to challenge directly. "Thank you, Mrs. Briggs," he said. You have been most helpful." We walked back along the corridor in silence, and it was not until we had reached the passage that connected the service quarters to the main hall that Holmes spoke, in a voice pitched for my ear alone. "She burned papers," he said, "not in her own grate. In Linton's, the morning he was found, before the constable arrived. She was protecting the household, as she has protected it for 37 years. But in doing so she destroyed whatever Linton had retained of his correspondence with Carew." He walked on a few paces. "She did not know, I think, that she was removing the last evidence of a man's attempt to do right by his conscience. That is the particular cruelty of it. Loyalty, when it operates in the dark, cannot always distinguish between what it is sheltering and what it is smothering." I thought of the burn mark on the apron, and of the exhausted grief I had seen in her face, and of the voices heard through a thick door at 10:30 on the night before Linton died. "Fear, Watson," Holmes said softly as we emerged into the entrance hall and its cold, regular light, "is the most faithful of servants. It obeys long after love has failed." He said nothing further, and I did not press him, for the observation carried in it the quality of a door opening onto a room whose full contents he was not yet prepared to show me, and I had learned, across the length of our association, that such doors opened in Holmes's own time and not before. Chapter 7. The Accepted Explanation. Inspector Graves of the Dorchester Constabulary arrived at Trevelyan Court on the 3rd morning of our stay, having been summoned by Constable Rees with that species of bureaucratic instinct that leads junior officers to escalate any matter that has attracted the attention of a London detective. He was a large, deliberate man, broad through the shoulders and reddish about the face, with the unhurried authority of someone who has spent 20 years resolving the difficulties of a rural county and has developed, in the process, a settled preference for explanations that do not require more machinery than the situation strictly demands. He shook Holmes's hand with civil reserve, and mine with somewhat more warmth upon learning that I had served in Afghanistan, and then he proceeded to conduct his inquiry in a fashion that I observed Holmes watching with the polite attentiveness of a chess player watching an opponent pursue a strategy he has already identified as insufficient. The sequence of events that followed occupied the better part of the morning, and produced by the early afternoon a conclusion of the kind that Graves was temperamentally equipped to reach, and perhaps professionally obliged to. He had interviewed Constable Rees, Dr. Alderton, as Mrs. Briggs, Miss Eleanor, and Mr. Harbury in that order, with a thoroughness that was genuine, and a penetration that was limited by a prior certainty about the shape of the answer. He had examined Linton's room, the grate, the desk, and the medicine bottle, and had spoken at length with Alderton, who had confirmed his earlier opinion with the additional firmness of a man who's had a day to consolidate it. Graves assembled us in the drawing-room at 2 o'clock, which was a courtesy extended on Holmes's account and not strictly necessary, and delivered his findings with the measured gravity of a formal announcement. Jasper Linton, he said, had been a man of limited means and considerable anxiety, employed in a position of trust and access to documents of potential value. The evidence suggested that he had, at some point, recognised in the medieval charter an opportunity to profit by the alteration of a date, calculating that Mr. Harbury, finding himself the beneficiary of a windfall inheritance, might prove grateful in material terms. The scheme had been cleverly conceived but imperfectly executed, and as the probability of its exposure grew, Linton had experienced an escalating nervous crisis that culminated, in combination with the pre-existing condition of his heart, in collapse and death. The burned papers in the grate were consistent with the destruction of incriminating correspondence. The searched desk drawer was consistent with Linton's own agitated review of his position in the hours before his death. "A thorough piece of work, Inspector," said Holmes when Graves had concluded, and the compliment was delivered with such perfect sincerity that it was only upon reflection that one recognised how little it actually endorsed. Graves accepted it at face value. He was not a stupid man, but he was a man who, having found a shape that fitted the available space, felt no pressing urgency to examine whether the space itself had been constructed to receive it. Harbury received the conclusion with what appeared to be unfeigned relief. He had been sitting throughout Graves's summary with his long hands upon his knees, and when Graves finished he exhaled slowly and said that he was deeply grieved for Linton's family, and deeply thankful that the charter could now be set aside. He looked, I thought, genuinely lighter, or as a man looks who has been carrying a weight on behalf of someone else and has been told he may set it down. Miss Eleanor sat quite still throughout, her hands folded in her lap, her face arranged in the composed gravity of a woman receiving difficult news with appropriate dignity. She thanked the inspector for his diligence. She expressed sorrow for Linton, with whom she had worked in cordial professional proximity for many years. She said that she hoped the matter could now be concluded without further distress to anyone. Each statement was measured, appropriate, and entirely adequate to the situation as Graves had defined it. Holmes said nothing during any of this. He sat in his chair to the left of the fireplace with his legs crossed and his fingers lightly interlaced in his lap, and his expression throughout was one of calm, receptive attention that committed him to nothing whatsoever. I had seen that expression before, at other conclusions reached by other inspectors, and I knew what it meant. It meant that the performance was not yet over, and that Holmes was content for the present to allow the other participants to believe that it was. Graves departed at 3:30, satisfied and brisk. Pembroke saw him to the door with the professional cordiality of a solicitor who has obtained a useful result and is not disposed to interrogate it too closely. Harbury collected his hat and gloves and announced his intention of returning to London on the following morning's train, the cloud under which he'd been living having, as he said, quite thoroughly lifted, the household settled back into its modified routine, a quieter, diminished routine, with Linton's absence written into it like an erasure, and the drawing-room was empty by 4 o'clock, the curtains left open to the last of the thin afternoon light. And Holmes and I sat on either side of the fire in the particular silence that follows a scene of apparent resolution, and I was aware, with the certainty of long experience, that Holmes's stillness was not the stillness of agreement. It was the stillness of contained knowledge, of a man who possesses the concluding chapter of a book that others believe to have ended 3 pages earlier. I poured the tea that Mrs. Briggs had left and set a cup at his elbow, and after a while I said, "You do not intend to let it rest?" "No," said Holmes. He reached for the cup without looking at it. "Inspector Graves has constructed a perfectly serviceable explanation, Watson. It accounts for most of what is visible, and requires the fewest assumptions about the people involved. It has the considerable virtue, from certain points of view, of being entirely comfortable." "And the inconvenient virtue of being wrong," I said. Holmes smiled slightly. "Incomplete is perhaps the more precise word. It is not wholly wrong. Linton was, I believe, involved in the alteration of the charter. His anxiety, his intention to travel to London, his burned papers, his searched desk, all of that is real, and all of it was correctly observed by both Rees and Graves. What their explanation does not account for is why a man who forged a document for personal gain would consult a paleographical expert 9 days after its discovery, or why his medicine bottle should contain more bromide than his physician prescribed, or why a section of the kitchen garden wall should have been repointed within the last 12 months. He set down his cup and looked into the fire. "Nor does it account for the date." I waited. "The date on the charter," he said quietly. "I have been thinking about it since yesterday evening. Graves assumed, as Pembroke's specialist assumed, that the date was chosen to maximise the benefit to the forger or his imagined patron. But when I examine precisely which dates would have best served Harbury's interests and compare them to the date actually used, there is a discrepancy. The date on the charter is not the optimal one for Harbury's claim." He paused. "It is, however, very nearly the optimal date for another purpose entirely, one that has nothing to do with Harbury." He said this last sentence in a tone of such level, private certainty, that the drawing-room seemed for a moment to contract around it. I asked him what purpose. He turned from the fire and looked at me, and in the fading afternoon light his face had the particular quality of controlled alertness that meant he was approaching the moment at which the scattered evidence resolved into pattern. "Tomorrow," he said, "I wish to examine the charter one final time in the morning light, and I wish to have another look at the kitchen garden wall. After that, I think we shall be in a position to have a very different kind of conversation with Miss Eleanor Trevelyan than the one Inspector Graves has already concluded." He reached for his pipe at last. "All except Holmes," he added softly, with a faint, humourless echo of some private irony, and said nothing further for the rest of the evening. The fire burned down and the light failed, and I sat in the quiet of Trevelyan Court thinking of a date written upon old vellum by a careful hand, and of all the things that a wrong date might be designed not to give, but to take away. Chapter 8. The Misdated Detail. The morning came in grey and still, with a frost on the grass that had not been there the evening before, and a sky the colour of old pewter pressed flat against the horizon. I dressed early, drawn by some anticipatory restlessness that I recognised as the particular alertness Holmes's proximity produced in me when a case was approaching its resolution, and found him already in the corridor outside my room, coat on, the charter in its transparent covering tucked beneath his arm, moving toward the back staircase with the quiet purposefulness of a man executing a plan formed hours ago. We went first to the kitchen garden. The frost had stiffened the path, and our footsteps announced themselves with a crispness that Holmes did not appear to find inconvenient, which suggested he was not concerned about being observed at this hour. The garden lay in deep shadow, the vegetable bed cut back and blanketed with straw for the winter, the espaliered fruit trees against the south wall reduced to their structural essentials, bare branches pressed flat against the stone like the diagrams of themselves. The section of wall Holmes had noted 2 days previously was in the eastern corner, where the kitchen garden met the old orchard boundary. Standing before it in the early light, I could see what he had meant about the mortar. The surrounding courses were of a lime render weathered to a soft grey, cracked along its surface in the irregular manner of old work long settled. The repaired section was perhaps 20 inches wide and 4 courses tall, its mortar a fractionally different shade, very nearly matched but not quite, and its surface smooth where the surrounding work was textured by time. The repair was good. It was not invisible. Holmes produced a small pocket knife and ran its blade gently along the edge of the repaired section, feeling the joint between old and new. Then he pressed 2 fingers against the centre stone, leaning his weight slightly forward. The stone did not move, but it shifted. The faintest, almost inaudible shift of loosened material within the cavity behind it. Holmes straightened and looked at the wall for a long moment, with an expression of complete composure, as though it had confirmed something so precisely expected that the confirmation itself contained no element of surprise. He replaced the knife, tucked the charter more securely under his arm, and turned away from the wall without touching it further. "Enough," he said quietly. "I do not need to see what is there. I need only to know that something is." We crossed back through the garden in silence and entered the house through the side door, emerging into the corridor that connected the service wing to the main hall. The house was beginning to stir, the sounds of the kitchen reaching us from further along, the smell of coal smoke and bread. Holmes stopped at the library door, which Pembroke had confirmed was available to us, and we went in and shut it behind us. The library at Trevelyan Court was a long, north-facing room lined with the practical, rather than the decorative variety of country house books. Your county histories and agricultural manuals and bound volumes of the local gazette standing alongside the standard works of reference that every gentleman's library contained as a matter of form rather than use. It was cold and very quiet, and the light from the tall windows was the flat, clear, shadowless light that is best suited to the examination of documents. Holmes laid the charter upon the reading table and stood over it for a long time without his lens, merely looking, in the manner of a man who has already formed his conclusion and is now tracing the path by which the evidence leads to it most directly. Then he removed the lens and bent low, moving it with great slowness across the surface of the vellum, pausing at intervals with the concentration of a jeweller examining a stone for internal flaws. He spoke as he worked, which was unusual. Ordinarily his examinations were conducted in absolute silence, the results reported only when they were complete. That morning he narrated, almost as though thinking aloud, and I understood that he was arranging the evidence into the sequence in which he intended to present it. "The vellum itself is genuine," he said without looking up. "Medieval, certainly. The scribble hand is consistent with the period. Someone with knowledge of 14th century documentary conventions prepared this text, and prepared it with care. A casual forger would not have managed the abbreviations correctly, nor the formulaic Latin of the grant clause." He moved the lens along the lower margin. "But here, do you see this, Watson? Come closer." I bent beside him and he directed my attention to a small area of the text near the foot of the document, where the date clause was written. To my unpractised eye it appeared entirely uniform with the surrounding text. "The ink," Holmes said. "Observe the quality of the stroke at the edge of the numeral. Elsewhere the ink has penetrated the vellum in the manner of old iron gall, deeply absorbed into the surface over centuries. Here, at the date specifically, the penetration is shallower. The ink sits fractionally higher. It was applied to a vellum already aged, rather than aging alongside the surrounding text." He straightened. "It is precisely what one would expect if a genuine medieval document had its date altered at a later period. The body of the document is old. The date is not." He set down the lens and turned to face the window, his hands behind his back. "Now consider the date itself. The 14th year of Edward IV's reign corresponds to 1474. The charter references, in its boundary clause, a minor assessment described as the Trevelyan Mill Levy, which is presented as an established charge upon the land. I spent some time last evening with the county history on that shelf behind you." He nodded toward the volumes, and I retrieved the one he indicated, a thick, cloth-bound history of Dorsetshire tenure published some 30 years previously. "Page 217, he said. I found it. The entry was brief, concerned with a local system of mill taxation introduced in the western hundreds of Dorsetshire. The date of its introduction was given as 1477. 3 years after the date on the charter, I said. Precisely. A document of 1474 cannot reference a tax that did not exist until 1477. The error is small enough that a general reader, or even a legal specialist primarily concerned with property law rather than local history, might easily overlook it. But it is unambiguous. The date as written is impossible." He paused. "And yet here is where it becomes, to my mind, the most interesting detail in the entire case." He picked up the charter and held it at arm's length, looking at it as a painter regards a canvas he is assessing for composition. The optimal date for Harbury's claim, the date that would have maximised the legal force of the property transfer and been most difficult to contest, would have been 1471 or 1472 during Edward's first reign, when the tenurial records for this area are thinnest and hardest to cross-reference. A forger acting purely in Harbury's interest would have chosen one of those years without hesitation. He set the document down. The date chosen is 1474, not the strongest date for Harbury, but a date that falls precisely within the window that nullifies a series of debt instruments recorded in Sir Matthew's ledgers against the tenant lands, instruments which, if valid, would give the estate a legal charge over certain properties, enforceable against the current occupant's descendants. I was quiet for a moment, assembling this. "The charter was not forged primarily to give Harbury the land," I said slowly. "It was forged," Holmes said, "to extinguish the debt charges that Sir Matthew imposed upon his tenants. Harbury's inheritance was, I believe, an incidental consequence that was either not fully anticipated or was considered an acceptable complication. The lands that would pass to Harbury represent only a fraction of the estate. The debt charges, had they been enforced, would have affected nearly a third of the tenanted farms." He turned from the table and looked at me directly. Linton did not choose this date. He was not learned enough in local tenurial history to have done so with this precision. Someone directed him to it. Someone who had studied Sir Matthew's ledgers in very considerable detail and knew exactly what a document dated 1474 would accomplish. He picked up the lens and pocketed it, with the deliberateness of a man closing a chapter. The forgery was not primarily an act of personal acquisition, Watson. It was an act of restitution, imperfect, illegal, and determined, and it was conceived by a mind that understood both its purpose and its risk with complete clarity. The library was very still. Beyond the windows, the frost was lifting from the grass in the strengthening light, each blade releasing its rime in a slow, general brightening. "She had read every document in this library," Holmes replied, before I had quite finished forming the thought, "and every ledger in that study, and she had years enough of cause to do so very thoroughly indeed." He gathered the charter and moved toward the door, and I followed, number carrying with me the particular sensation of having watched a complex mechanism arrive, with quiet inevitability, at the position toward which all its parts had been tending from the very beginning. The case was not yet concluded, but its shape was now entirely visible, and it was, in the cold library light of that autumn morning, both clearer and considerably sadder than I had anticipated. Chapter 9. Holmes reveals the truth. Holmes sent notes to Pembroke, Miss Eleanor, and Harbury that morning, requesting their presence in the drawing-room at 3 o'clock. He composed each one at the library desk with the economical deliberateness he brought to all written communication, folding them himself and handing them to Mrs. Briggs in the corridor without explanation or elaboration. She received them and withdrew, and Holmes watched the door close behind her with the expression of a man who has set a mechanism in motion and is content to allow it to run. The hours between breakfast and the appointed time he spent in a manner I found characteristic of his particular variety of mental preparation. He did not review his notes, for he kept none in the conventional sense, his methods of retention being entirely his own. He did not pace or deliberate aloud or seek conversation. He sat for a period in the library with a volume of Dorsetshire history open, but unread upon his knee, and then walked twice around the south lawn in the cold, and then returned to our sitting room and played upon the violin he had brought in his travelling case, not the elaborate improvisations that signalled active rationnation, but something quieter and more resolved, a single melodic line repeated with slight variations, as a man might turn a key in a lock to confirm that it fits before committing himself to opening the door. At 5 minutes before 3, I accompanied him downstairs. The drawing-room had been arranged, whether by Mrs. Briggs's instinct or Holmes's quiet instruction I could not say, with chairs placed in a loose semicircle before the fireplace, the afternoon light entering from the west-facing windows at a low, level angle that illuminated the room without warmth. Pembroke was already present when we entered, standing near the window with his briefcase at his feet, his expression that of a solicitor who has been called to a meeting whose agenda he suspects will require careful professional navigation. Harbury arrived a moment later, still in his travelling coat, having apparently been on the point of departure when Holmes's note reached him. He took a chair near the door with the unconscious positioning of a man who is not certain whether he is a witness or a participant. Miss Eleanor came last, which I thought was deliberate. She entered without haste, dressed in the same black she had worn throughout our stay, and took the chair nearest the fireplace with the composure of a woman who has chosen her ground and intends to hold it. Her eyes went to Holmes as she sat, and they remained upon him with a quality of attention that was neither afraid nor defiant, but simply very direct, the attention of an intelligent person who knows that what is coming cannot be altered, and has resolved to meet it on her own terms. Holmes waited until the room had settled into stillness, and then he began. He spoke without preamble and without theatrical arrangement, in the measured, precise manner he invariably employed when presenting a completed chain of reasoning to an audience that included at least one person who already knew its conclusion. He was not performing. He was, in the most exact sense of the word, explaining, and the explanation moved from its first premise to its last, with the clean, unhurried logic of a proof. He began with the charter, establishing its physical evidence, the shallower ink penetration at the date, the anachronistic mill levy reference, the demonstration that the chosen date, 1474, served a purpose quite different from the one Inspector Graves had assumed. He moved to the ledgers, the sequestration entries, the debt instruments whose nullification the chosen date would accomplish, and he set the county history open upon the table before him, so that Pembroke could see for himself the entry establishing the mill levy's introduction 3 years after the date inscribed upon the vellum. Pembroke's expression changed during this portion of the account, the professional neutrality giving way to a dawning and rather uncomfortable recognition. Harbury sat very still, his hands clasped between his knees, listening with the fixed attention of a man hearing an explanation for something that has been disturbing him from the beginning. Holmes then traced the history of the enterprise as he had reconstructed it. A plan formed, he said, not in haste or passion, but over a considerable period of reflection and preparation, by someone with intimate knowledge of both the estate's historical documents and its contemporary legal encumbrances. That person had identified in the family's collection of medieval records a genuine document capable of being altered with sufficient expertise to withstand casual examination, and had enlisted Jasper Linton, who possessed the necessary paleographical knowledge accumulated over years of cataloguing Sir Matthew's papers, to execute the specific alteration of the date. Linton's involvement, Holmes said, was not that of a willing forger seeking personal gain. It was that of a man who had been persuaded that a technical illegality was justified by a deeper moral imperative. He was a conscientious man, and his conscience, once engaged, was not easily quieted. When he came to understand the full implications of what he had done, and in particular when he began to apprehend that the consequences for Mr. Harbury had not been adequately considered, he sought independent expert opinion. His letter to Dr. Nick Carew in Bloomsbury was not the act of a man covering his tracks. It was the act of a man who needed to be told, by someone he could not influence, and who owed him nothing, whether what he had helped create was as detectable as he feared. He paused here, and the room was entirely still. Carew's reply, or the anticipation of it, resolved him. He intended to come forward, and that intention, communicated in confidence to someone within this household, was the thing that made him, in a specific and calculated sense, dangerous. Holmes turned to face Miss Eleanor directly, and his voice did not change in its register or its pace, which made what followed more rather than less difficult to hear. You learned from Mrs. Briggs that Linton had resolved to act. You went to him that evening, the evening before his death, and you spoke with him at length. You did not go in anger. I do not believe anger was any part of it. You went because you had known him for 11 years and believed you could appeal to his understanding of what the debt instruments would mean for the tenants, persuade him that the good the charter would accomplish outweighed the irregularity of its creation. But he would not be persuaded. He was, as I said, a conscientious man. He let this rest for a moment. You had access to his medicine. You had been aware of his cardiac condition, as everyone in this household had been, and you knew the prescription Alderton had given him, a significantly larger dose, administered in his nightly preparation, would not have been certain in its effect, but in a man of his constitution, under his degree of nervous strain, it was probable. He paused once more. You did not go to him intending murder. I think that is the truth, and I will not pretend otherwise. You went intending silence, believing that the means available to you fell short of what the law would call killing. You were wrong in that belief, Miss Trevelyan, but I do not think you were dishonest in holding it. The fire crackled. Outside the windows a rook called once and fell quiet. Miss Eleanor had not moved throughout this account. She had listened with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes upon Holmes with that same quality of direct, unflinching attention. And when he finished, she was silent for a moment that was neither theatrical nor evasive, but simply the pause of a person finding the right words for a thing that matters. You intended not murder, Miss Trevelyan, Holmes said quietly, but silence. Yet the law recognizes no such distinction. No, she said. I did not suppose it would. Her voice was quite steady. I will tell you what I told Jasper that night. That my brother took from those families the security of their homes and their children's futures within the letter of contracts he himself had drawn, and that no court of law would ever require him to account for it. That the only remedy I could construct, imperfect as it was, would prevent the same instruments being enforced against people who could not defend themselves. She looked at Holmes without appeal, without calculation, simply with the level gaze of a person prepared to accept the weight of what she has done. I was not under any illusion that I was acting rightly. I was acting as I judged it necessary to act, which is a rather different thing, and which I understood from the beginning carried consequences. I persuaded Jasper by telling him the same thing, she continued after a brief pause, that the consequences, if they came, were mine to bear. He held me to that, in the end, or even in his opposition to me. He would not have said so, but his intention to come forward was itself a form of holding me to it. Something shifted in her expression, not grief exactly, but a complicated acknowledgement of a debt unpayable. He was a good man. What happened to him is the thing I cannot make into anything other than what it is. The silence that followed this was of a different quality from those that had preceded it. Harbury had looked away toward the window. Pembroke sat with his pen between his fingers and his notebook unopened, a solicitor temporarily in the excess of his professional vocabulary. Holmes held her gaze for a long moment with an expression that I had not seen on his face before and have not seen since. Not sympathy precisely, for he was too honest a man to offer what the situation did not permit, but something in the neighbourhood of it, a recognition of the full dimensions of what stood before him. Then he turned to Pembroke, who had been sitting throughout with the rigid stillness of a man reconciling his professional obligations with his human sympathies. "I think you'd better send for Inspector Graves," Holmes said. Pembroke nodded, rose, and went without a word to the door. I remained where I was, watching Miss Eleanor Trevelyan sit very still in her chair by the fire in the house she had managed and loved, and in the end acted so disastrously to preserve. And I found that I could not look at her without feeling something that the circumstances did not straightforwardly justify, and that I was quite unable to dismiss. Holmes came to stand beside me, and after a moment he said, in a voice intended only for my ear, "Justice is a cold instrument, Watson. It is fortunate, perhaps, that it is not ours to wield. We are only asked to see clearly. What is done with the seeing is another matter entirely." I did not reply, and he did not appear to require it. Chapter 10. Watson's Reflection. Inspector Graves returned to Trevelyan Court before the last light had gone from the sky, arriving with the subdued efficiency of a man who had received an unexpected communication and was resolved to handle its implications with the minimum of visible disturbance. He spoke with Holmes privately for the better part of 20 minutes in the library, and when he emerged his expression was that of someone who has revised a conclusion he had been quite comfortable with, and found the revision disagreeable but inescapable. He spoke briefly with Pembroke, briefly with Miss Eleanor, and then with a formal quietness that I found, under the circumstances, rather to his credit, he asked Miss Trevelyan if she would accompany him to Dorchester. She rose without hesitation and without any theatrical quality of resignation, as though she had been waiting for precisely this request and had decided at some earlier point exactly how she would meet it. She asked only for a few minutes to collect certain personal items and to speak with Mrs. Briggs, which Graves permitted. Mrs. Briggs received the news in the hall with a stillness so complete that it was itself a form of expression, her face doing nothing at all for a long moment, and then composing itself into the absolute composure of a woman who has loved a household for 37 years and must now watch one of its last members leave it under conditions she does not have the words to describe. They spoke quietly together at the foot of the stairs, too quietly for anything to reach me where I stood with Pembroke near the drawing-room door, and then Miss Eleanor pressed Mrs. Briggs's hand once, with a brevity that said more than any prolonged farewell could have managed, and followed Graves to the waiting carriage without looking back. Harbury, who had remained in the drawing-room throughout this departure, watching the fire with the uncertain expression of a man who has been peripheral to events of considerable gravity and is unsure what his continued presence signifies, rose when Holmes re-entered, and asked, in a voice carefully stripped of everything except the genuine concern it contained, what would become of the estate. Holmes told him what he could, which was that the charter would be set aside as fraudulent, that the will would stand, and that the legal question of the debt instruments Sir Matthew had imposed upon his tenants would require fresh examination in light of the evidence contained in the ledgers. Whether that examination would produce a remedy for those affected was, he said, a matter for the courts and for the people who chose to pursue it. He was precise and measured, and he did not offer comfort beyond what the facts warranted. Harbury was quiet for a moment after this. Then he said, with a simplicity I found rather admirable, that he had already consulted Pembroke about the possibility of establishing voluntarily and without legal compulsion a fund to address the arrears those families had been forced to discharge under Sir Matthew's instruments. He was not a wealthy man, he said, but the matter had troubled him since he first learned of it, and he preferred to act than to wait. Holmes looked at him for a moment with an attention that was, I thought, not entirely without warmth. "That is well considered, Mr. Harbury," he said, and Harbury nodded and said no more about it, which struck me as the response of a man whose impulse toward decency was genuine rather than performed. We left Trevelyan Court the following morning on the first available train, and the house receded behind its copper beeches in the early light, with the same composed and unrevealing face it had presented upon our arrival, as though the events of the preceding days had been absorbed into its grey stone and were now simply part of the long accumulation of things those walls had witnessed and kept to themselves. I watched it from the carriage until the lane curved and the beeches closed behind it, and then I turned my attention to the countryside moving past the window and to the particular quality of morning light on the frost-stiffened fields, and allowed my mind to begin the slow work of ordering what I had seen and felt into something that might eventually be written down. Holmes sat across from me with his coat collar turned up and his eyes at half close, which in other men would have indicated drowsiness, but in him indicated the particular variety of retrospective assessment he applied to concluded cases, running back through their sequences to examine the points at which the path had forked, and to note, for his own private satisfaction, which turnings he had taken correctly and which had required revision. He did not invite conversation, and I did not offer it until we were past Dorchester, and the rhythm of the train had established itself as a suitable accompaniment to reflection. "Holmes," I said at last, "do you believe the courts will deal leniently with her?" He opened his eyes fully and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think it probable," he said. "The circumstances are unusual, and the provocation, while it cannot constitute a legal defence, is of a kind that tends to move juries in directions the strict letter of the indictment does not anticipate. She is a woman of evident intelligence and social standing. She acted without personal financial motive, and her victim, if we are to use the word, was a man whose death was not entirely separable from his own physical constitution and his own moral crisis." He paused. "I would not predict acquittal. But I would not predict severity either." He looked out the window for a moment at the passing country, and then said more quietly, "What I find I cannot resolve to my satisfaction is the question of Sir Matthew." I said I was not sure I followed him. "Sir Matthew Trevelyan acted entirely within the law," Holmes said. "Every sequestration was documented, every debt instrument properly executed, every eviction conducted with the procedural correctness his solicitor would have required, and he broke no statute and violated no contract as the courts would have read it. He was, in the conventional sense, a just man." He paused again. "And yet 10 families lost the security of their holdings, and a woman of considerable principle came to believe that the law's silence on the matter required her to act outside it, and a conscientious secretary is dead." He turned from the window. "The law, Watson, is a blunt instrument. It strikes where it may. Our task is merely to see that it does not strike blindly." We were quiet for a time after that, and I watched the fields unroll past the window and thought about the word justice, which had been present in everything that had happened at Trevelyan Court, and had been consistently, in each of its appearances, not quite the same thing as the word law. They had moved in parallel throughout the case, those two words, and close enough to be mistaken for one another at a glance, and far enough apart to have produced in the space between them a forged document, a death and an arrest. I thought of Miss Eleanor at the foot of the stairs, pressing Mrs. Briggs's hand. I thought of Linton's desk drawer, replaced at a fractionally incorrect angle by someone who had searched it in darkness. I thought of Harbury saying, without elaboration or appeal for credit, that he preferred to act. And I thought of Holmes across the breakfast table of a Baker Street morning, the autumn light thin through the windows saying that documents seldom err without human assistance, which was true, and which was also, I'd come to understand, a considerably more complicated observation than it appeared upon first hearing. Documents do not err, but the people who make them, alter them, conceal them, and discover them are in the business of error continuously. Error and conscience and the sometimes violent collision between what the law permits and what the heart cannot endure. That, I reflected, as the train drew us north toward London, and the sky ahead cleared to a pale and wintry blue, was the substance of the case of the misdated charter. Holmes had navigated it by reason alone, as he navigated everything, and reason had led him, as it generally did, to a truth that was precise and unambiguous. What reason could not resolve, and what I found myself carrying as the miles accumulated between us and the grey house among the beeches, was the question of whether the truth, in this particular instance, had been entirely a mercy. I did not ask Holmes what he thought about that. I knew well enough what he would say, and I knew equally well that his saying it would not settle the matter, which was, I supposed, what made it worth writing down.